morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from the Center on PBIS. My name is Maria Reina Santiago Rosario, and I'm a research associate here at the University of Oregon and a implementation partner with the Center on PBIS. Today, I'll have the privilege of speaking with you about reducing exclusionary practices in schools. And particularly, I'll be sharing with you more about an example of how we can embed restorative practices within PBIS. So before I go ahead and get started, I wanted to acknowledge the members of the PBIS Equity Work Group, which was established in 2013. And this is our current membership. So a lot, or some of the materials that you'll see here today have been put together by members of this group, some past members. And I also want to acknowledge the Project ISLA team at the University of Oregon, the principal investigator and co-PIs, Ron Denise, Joe Neese, Ken McIntosh, and Rob Horner, as well as the trainer developers, intervention advisors, and research assistants, as I'll be sharing with you their work and efforts throughout the last about 5 years now. I would like to also get a sense of who is with me here in this room. So take a moment to answer what is your level, if you're like a school district, region, state, or federal employee, and what your role is within your setting. And I am seeing that almost half of the room works at the state level, and many are in other positions, in addition to state or regional trainer coach, some district trainers and admins, a few school administrators. Okay, so I will be closing the poll in the next 3 seconds. So if you want to add and participate. Okay. Thank you so much for giving me an idea. I'll speak with you about our implementation efforts and how we've gone about rolling out this multi-component intervention at a district level. In terms of our training or our time today, it is 1 hour long. So this goes by very quickly. So I won't be able to go in depth into every single component of the presentations. So I'm assuming that we are well aware of the challenges that come with school discipline and disparities or inequities that we do see in our practices and student outcomes. And if you're not as familiar, I've included some links on here to orient the group in further understanding the challenge and the commitment to doing equity work and coaching school and district teams on it. I'm assuming that we're well aware that prevention is it's the foundation. So it's the foundation for practice and policy reforms to decrease discipline exclusion. And that in terms of restorative practices in education, that we are really grounding the work on a collective, fair process that really builds on relationships to bolster accountability. So it's really moving away from a punitive perspective into a proactive prevention where students get to better understand the context and be able to make amends with adults in the school. As we move into the webinar, I just wanted to be explicit about ways that you can interact with me. So as you may have noticed already, the audio and video are off for participants, as well as the hand raising option. You can chat with me or with attendees, so feel free to put any thoughts on there as we go through the content. But I will ask you to add specific questions on the question and answer panel, just in case we got a lot of movement in chat. I want to make sure that we don't miss any. By the end of the webinar, I will make sure to address some of them, and or as many as I can within the time that we have remaining. In terms of the overview of the session, I will very briefly introduce latest numbers in terms of racial inequities in school discipline. I will be talking about or exploring more ways in which we can reduce disproportionate use of exclusion, ways in which we can embed restorative practices within an MTSS framework, using the example of the inclusive skill building learning approach, or ISLA, as an example in which we do this merge of PBIS and restorative practices across a continuum of graduated discipline practices. So in terms of racial inequities in school discipline, I know we're well aware of the problem, but I just wanted to share with folks the latest statistics, national statistics put up by the Office of Civil Rights and the data collection. The latest numbers are from the academic year 2017-2018. And as you can see on here, Black students continue to receive one or more in school suspension and one or more out of school suspension at rates that were more than twice their share of total student enrollment. And we do see that American Indian students or Alaska Native students were slightly overrepresented as well in these numbers. I appreciate the statistics in terms of, transforming those numbers into how much instructional time students actually get to lose. And as a collective, we know that students missed over 11 million days of school just due to out-of-school suspension. And when we look at this number for Black students specifically, we see that this group of students missed over 4 million days of schools just due to out-of-school suspension, not including expulsion or just these informal ways in which schools can exclude students, like by sending them to the office or just having a kid sit in the hallway. So just think about the impact and all the instruction this group of students is missing, and how that impact their ability to learn, to share with their peers, and just keep up and succeed or exceed with the rest of their peers. So in terms of reducing disproportionate use of exclusion, I know that we're well aware of PBIS, or positive behavioral intervention supports as a systems and its element, and the importance of centering equity to make sure that we are building systems that really set up our students to succeed, systems that also set up our adults to succeed by building capacity so that they can learn or adapt practices to meet the needs and values of their community, that they are setting high expectations for each student, that teams are being very intentional in the way that they're using their data and looking at their data in disaggregate ways, so they can understand the ways in which a system is supporting certain groups and which ones it might not be supporting in the moment, so that changes can be made and intervention plans can be modified to make sure that we're being responsive and proactive about it. And that we're supporting our educators through equity-focused PD. And really, when we're thinking about centering equity within the PBIS framework, we're really talking about 5 particular practices that we encourage folks to be very intentional with in implementing PBIS. We're talking about collecting, using, and reporting disaggregated data. We're talking about implementing a behavior framework that is preventive, multi-tiered, and culturally responsive. That we're using engaging instructions to reduce the opportunity gap. That we're developing policies with accountability for disciplinary equity, and that we're teaching strategies for neutralizing implicit bias and discipline decisions. And we know that when interventions embed one or more of these components, we get different outcomes, such as decreasing racial inequities in exclusionary school discipline, also decreasing this exclusion for non-Black students, so for every student as well, that we get to improve teacher ratings of student behavior, decreasing racial academic disparities. We get to improve preschool personnel's capacity to support children's development of social, emotional, and behavioral growth. We get to improve perceptions of school climate and school connectedness, as well as saving administrative time for their duties and teachers' time to use for instructional activities. So we really want to be focusing on improving these practices and making sure that we are providing our adults the training needed, and that we are following the routines and procedures that go along with these, with this. In terms of embedding restorative practices within MTSS, let's define restorative practices first. And as a foundation, we know that restorative practice is really a relational approach in which we're bracing or building community, and we are preventing discipline incidents using concrete activities such as circles, such as advisory, time to teach, skills, social, emotional, behavioral skills in which we might need to be mediating if a conflict occur, among other practices across the continuum of tiers. In the face of conflict, the focus of restorative practices is really on identifying the needs of those that are affected by the behavioral incidents and those who might have brought harm with their behavior in that moment. So folks are supported, but also hold accountable at the same time. And through research, we've learned that restorative practices really is better advanced through the infrastructure of MTSS, and that this work really, it's a multi-year effort like many other educational initiatives. So moving into the example that I want to speak with you today, the inclusive skill building learning approach. What am I really speaking of when I talk about this ISLA framework? ISLA has 3 main components. We really focus on building classroom preventions, like focusing on building relationships, building strong classroom expectations and routines, teaching those explicitly, training our adults in effective responses to behavior and understanding really the escalation cycle and the strategies that you could use at different points so that it really meets or match the need of the student based on this framework. We really focus on developing school-wide break systems so that students can get to learn how to regulate and advocate for themselves, and ask for these moments to reset, or have the teacher request the student to take a break if needed. And as well as having reconnection conversations between teacher and the student, or among peers if an incident within the classroom were to occur. We also embed restorative and instructional components, and this is where the focus of the presentation will be today. We'll be talking about the triage process in which the school staff gets to assess if it's a safety concern who will be managing or supporting the student during that time outside of the classroom. The opportunity to really listen and show yourself authentically, to listen to the student and understand from their perspective what happened in the classroom, so that we can use that information to help them identify skills that would be beneficial for them to learn and practice with an adult and supported and guided support, so that they can go back and reconnect with their teachers and also practice this holding yourself accountable and understanding as well the impact that your behavior have on others. And then we have the team component like PBIS and other systems initiatives. We train a leadership team that will be using data for decision-making, the fidelity of implementation tracking, that we're doing what we said that we're going to be doing, to know if it's having an effect on student behavior, and really guiding action planning if needed, and using the staff input to guide the team's effort in modifying the action plan for the year. So here's another visual of elements of ISLA. As you can see, this is a graduated discipline model. So we really focus on preventative classroom practices, and the team train staff on what we call the WOW strategy. So we start with welcoming students at the door, owning your classroom environment, which really means setting clear expectations and building those routines, and wrapping up with intentions, and really being very intentional in developing times during the day in which you do get to know your students better, get to assess how they're doing, get to connect and have them build community together at the end of the class day. We train on in-class effective responses to behavior, so function of behavior, the escalation cycle, developing a system, break systems in school. And then we have the out-of-class ISLA supports, which we'll talk about more, and the resolution and reconnection with the additional supports. And why am I sharing about ISLA? Well, we know that ISLA has the potential of being an effective intervention, school-wide intervention that reduces ODRs, or office discipline referrals, as well as in-school and out-of-school suspension, and that it really helps schools save students' time for instruction. So we've seen how from losing about over 1,000 minutes in one of the schools and over 500 on the other, to losing approximately, or on average, 75 to 45 minutes. So through this process, we get to support students, give them the opportunity to build skills and get back to their classroom for learning. And I see that Carrie's asking, what does ISLA stand for? It stands for the Inclusive Skill Building Learning Approach. So let's focus on the out-of-class ISLA supports. So when I'm talking about the ISLA process, we're really talking of providing instructional supports in lieu of exclusion. And these really include having a student debrief, skills coaching on appropriate behavior, practicing with the student, the reentry plan, and then supporting that transition process and that connection with the teacher once in the classroom. And what are the goals of ISLA? So really is to strengthen preventative supports at the school-wide and classroom level. It's really to reduce the amount of missed instructional times that student lose in these informal ways in which they get excluded when they're sent out of the classroom to the office or just to spaces in the school to maybe get support, maybe not until they get called back into the room. It's really to improve behavior support for students so that that time that they're out of the room is really being used proactively, that they're getting support with skill development, that there's a chance of improving the student-teacher relationship earlier on, and that we're really reducing the use of exclusion. So here's an image of what the ISLA triage process looks like. And this is really just visualized as intended by the research team, what we've had in mind and trained schools in, and we've learned as with other components of PBIS, it needs to get adapted to its context. So this is just kind of like a visual guide, but it might be needed, definitely needs to be seen by a team, looked at what might remain similar, what might change depending on the school or district's settings. So even though we try, right? We train on prevention, we're training on effective behavior supports in the classroom and implementing many strategies to avoid the need to send a student out of the classroom. We know that this might happen, that there will be behavioral incidents in which the student will be sent out. So when this happened, right, we train teachers on best practices for how to do this, right? And this is really based on what we've heard from students in the past on the importance of being discreet and modeling respect, of the importance of maintaining the flow of instruction once this is happening, and communicating with the student. The amount of students that we've heard from that have been sent out and don't really understand even why. So really making sure that adults are communicating with folks what happened specifically, and so that they can understand why they're being asked to be sent out for support. And then completing the documentation that's requested in the school so that other adults in schools know where the student is at, know why they're there, and can use that information to start that debrief and skill building process with the student. So the first thing that we've asked, right, in the triage process is this behavior a safety concern? And usually when it is, it's an administrator who will be working with the student through the ISLA process. And if not, there's an ISLA support staff. And who might they be? The person might be different across schools. We've had schools where we've had teams kind of like identify who naturally talk with students and share with them when they're sent out of the room. And we've started with schools in that space. And over time, we've had district folks really work into their capacity, the role of a behavior support specialist that can do this work with students. So we start with that, with this piece of, is this a safety concern or not? And who will the student be sent to if they're sent out of the room? And once they're in this room, first things first, right? You would begin with a student check-in, and we really want to make folks aware that the student might be in a space to start chatting, or they might not. They might be in a dysregulated state where learning is not going to happen in that space, in that moment. So the importance of giving them a moment to kind of like compose themselves and be ready to talk with the adult in the room. And I kind of want to highlight a latest research that got posted by the Center on PBIS, developed by Kathleen Strickland-Cohen and colleagues, that really goes into what phases of escalation are and strategies that educators can use across the different phases to really support students' regulation before they can really learn from what happened and practice and skill build. So just a highlight here and research for folks to look into if they need to provide their adults in schools with more training on how to support student self-regulation before engaging in practices such as the debrief, for instance. So in terms of the student debrief, what really am I talking about? This step is a personal interview where the adult takes the time to listen to the student and let them share their perspective on the issue that leads them to being sent out of the room. It will also get at motivation as well as an appropriate alternative behavior that the student can practice. So it's really a conversation between the adult and the student, with open-ended questions paired with active listening and genuine interest. And it's really there to establish positive relationships with a supportive adult so that the student can feel heard and there's a focus on the learning opportunities. So let me share with you example of the debrief protocol that we share on our trainings and provide staff with the opportunity to practice in conversation, like doing a lot of role playing with different types of scenarios. It's not really meant to just be these 6 questions, but these are really just guiding conversation starters where it really get to the details of what happened, how, what did you do, what did others do, how that might have been interpreted by the persons in the room, how the action that they took might have worked for them, or how do you think it worked for others in the room, and get the student to reflect as well, like what might be a different way to problem solve the situation that was occurring in an instructional way, right? In a constructive way that gets them to access what they needed in that moment in an expected way. We also train folks on reflective statements in which they can help the student really sound back to them the emotions that they're communicating, and they may not be completely aware that they're feeling. So we provide opportunities to practice validation statements or opportunities where you get to reflect back what it is that you're hearing from the student, or does it seem like that was a hard thing to deal with, like what happened and how the student seemed to have reacted to that one. Summarizing statements. so that you're really assessing for understanding based on the student's perspective. We really want to make sure that we got that clear, reflecting meaning back to them so that it sounds like they felt angry or frustration about this particular incident that happened in the room, or when the teacher X, Y, and Z, and reflecting feelings back to them as well. So they get to build some self-awareness while they're having this conversation with you, the adult. So just examples of opportunities that we do build in training for folks. In terms of best practices, we really want the student to feel that they're at the same eye level as the adult in the room. So like sitting with them at that level of bringing yourself authentically into that conversation and being an active listener and staying neutral, allowing them to share and you listen as well, of asking follow-up questions so that you make sure that you're are receiving all the information that you need for the behavior skills coaching part of it, and problem solving. And we say that you can consider taking notes. That may or may not apply to you depending on how distracting that activity may be, but it could be helpful as you are working with the student and developing eventually a plan with them or co-constructing a plan with them before they re-entered the classroom. So having started that conversation with the student, getting their perspective, identifying what happened, what might be different things that they could try. Let's say you get to identify a possible behaviors, expected behavior that they could try, or alternative behavior that they can try instead. So having had the debrief and having heard from them, you would be moving into this coaching session with them, where you're identifying with the student the appropriate behavior that they could try instead. And this features identifying the skill together, teaching and modeling, practicing, providing opportunities to practice, of providing supported, guided support and performance feedback, and communicating with the staff members who are involved so that they understand what the student got to work with you during that session outside of the room. So here, the particular steps of determining the socially appropriate replacement skills, defining the goals, analyzing what that task or analyzing the skill involved so that you can explain when and why that skill is necessary, presenting the steps of that skill in order from least complex to most complex, and providing examples and non-examples. We do allow the student to practice this skill with support, provide the opportunities for the student to describe the behavior or role play with you, positively acknowledging them when they are engaging in that behavior with you, or providing corrective feedback when the skill is performed incorrectly or practiced incorrectly. And like I mentioned at the end, informing teachers and other key staff members of the skills coaching piece. So as part of our larger training, we really do spend more time thinking about the behaviors that students might be engaging in, the function or the intent behind that behavior, and generating ahead of time different appropriate or practice skills that you may engage in teaching when in these sessions, so that folks feel that they have a repertoire and have practice beforehand and have had the opportunity to think about scenarios. And for these, we've used even office discipline referrals in the same descriptions of the incidents as recorded with their systems to help staff start really engaging in these processing of identifying the most common skills that seem to be necessary to be really practicing and teaching students, because they're having a harder time engaging in them in the classroom. So after this process of behavior skills coaching, then there's this engagement of a reconnection conversation. So it's a guided opportunity that's provided to the students so that they get to reconnect with their teacher and make things right when they return to class. So the student is really identifying their own actions and what they will do next time. And ask, own to what supports they may need in the future. So it's really an opportunity to communicate expectations, to provide that emotional support, foster safety, and that practice opportunity for them, so that they can go up and really have this opportunity to talk to their teacher after. Here's an example of some conversation starters that we get to share with the staff who's doing this work to try with their students. This have been a work in progress. We've really modified these conversation starters based on educators' feedback, students' feedback, and parents as well. So you're seeing our most recent versions of it, where we're really making sure that it doesn't feel like a fake story, and that there's an honest reflection and owning responsibility for their actions. And I just wanted to show, and maybe you've seen some of these if you've been in any SLIT training at the PBIS forum, for instance, or you recently saw the keynote this year. But we get to see through some of these examples that sometimes students are really sent out of the classroom for things that, I don't know, it's kind of like choose your own battle. Do you really want to send a student outside of the classroom for tapping the pencil out of the desk? You may not, but it happens, and they're losing a lot of instructional time because of that. So here's an example of a student that got sent out that way, where they got to learn that, not to tap their pencil and have their head on the desk, and something that they can do to make things better, like copying the notes on the, I don't know what it says here, homework. Here's how I'm going to try and prevent this from happening again. So this is really a conversation. This is not really meant to be like a thing sheet that students complete by themselves. As you're having this conversation, the debrief and the behavior skills coaching, the person with the student can maybe be writing this as you're having that conclusion, coming to that conclusion with the students, or coming to those learning ahas with them throughout, or it might be the student writing it, but it's really meant to be that reflection and in vivo conversation with them that's informing the answers or what they've learned in practicing and talking about reconnection. Here's how they're going to prevent. And in order for me to be successful, getting the student to tell you what they need is huge. So if they can identify that for you, why not listen and use that to support them? They're having behind the pencil tapping and the putting the head down, there was a lot of academic frustration of them not knowing how to do the work that's being given to them, and that they don't understand that they've been having problems with math for like a long time. For instance, this is all information that you can get very early on when these systems are in place. Here's another example in which a student was getting distracted, easily distracted in the room, and was talking out loud and using the pencils and sharpening too much and making noise, and maybe not being quiet enough during reading time in the classroom. And that was the reason for which she or they got sent out. And again, we see here an example of having gone through this process, reflecting with an adult and learning to communicate what they need and the supports. So once this part of the conversation is practice with guided support, we think of the classroom reentry routine. So for the ISLA support staff, that might be following the established protocol by the school leadership team, in which you may escort back the student to the room. You might have a signal or like a way to communicate with the teacher that's not too intrusive of the instruction in the moment. And for the teacher, it's really providing them the opportunity ahead of time of thinking of that reentry routine. So how they can maintain instruction when the student come back, but make that time for talking with them in a more private setting. So we have staff and leadership things to consider, like ways in which the teacher should step into the hallway or into an appropriate space in the room so that this reconnection conversation can happen privately. And I know people that are involved within the incident should be part of it as well. We've definitely heard from a lot of students that they would rather have these conversations more privately than right in front of every single person in the room, because many times it really just feels like shaming, and the purpose of their reconnection kind of like get lost in those instances. How do, the ISLA support staff can encourage the student to maybe read the reconnection card if they're very nervous, or talk about it and provide their, like what they were able to learn through this opportunity and share that back, and really engaging in this process in a very, in more of a quick way rather than taking too long of a time. We really want to avoid re-escalating the situation, and kind of like going back to the problem rather than hearing how it had an impact on the student, what the student learned had an impact on them, and kind of like making amends. And for the student, for the teachers to consider really like allowing the student to have that reconnection moment with them. And if they do, really to allow that to happen without like a punishment or retribution or a grudge, so that really they can rejoin the class activity without like more further conversation about the problem. Because at that point, there's been an adult that has been working with the student to really engage in that self-reflection. So trusting that someone has been driving that point home as to how their behavior impacted the larger community. So just in terms of thinking of the routines, again, just thinking of the routines so it can transition into an activity and reconnecting with the student, or if you can reconnect in that moment, when might you find time to schedule a reconnection conversation? And we know that self-regulation is, takes time for both the adult and the student. So we acknowledge that adult might not be ready to reconnect right when the student come back in. The reconnection should happen as soon as possible so that we really can amend those relationships. But we got to honor the teacher's need as well. Just as with other aspects of this process, we provide some general language just with the idea of showing what we would ideally see, but also encouraging folks to find their voice and their true self so that their communication comes from an authentic standpoint and doesn't feel too, too inauthentic or not genuine enough. But, providing language to the adults is really helpful, and people really do appreciate those, even though it might at first might not look like this just might not sound like me. But just some examples that we share. And as part of the triage process, we don't stop just at that reentry. We really want to make sure that there's a follow-up process where the ISLA support staff, maybe, providing the reconnection card to the teacher, putting it in the mailbox if they can give it to them directly because of instruction, or have the student provide that to the teacher, completing the correct documentation of the ISLA process. So we can share more about this, and I'll provide more contact us information for the ISLA project, or if you have more questions about any of these resources, you can contact them there. But we would want folks to enter the information on when the student came in, when they left the room, what was the incident, the behavior that was identified as an appropriate or an alternative skill to the situation, and if the person went through each of the steps of the process, so implementation, fidelity, data, and this is completed. And for the teachers, really allowing them back into the classroom without that punishment or retribution. And that if the conversation can happen at that moment, that there's time for it that's made, so that it does happen. So we really want to build this process in which there's communication among adults as well. So we want folks to be thinking of who needs to know what skills the student worked on. So if this is a student that has a support team, because they do receive tier 2 or tier 3 level support, that the people that work with them, who may or may not include the ISLA support staff, that they know what happened and the skill that the student worked on with them in that space, the documentation that needs to happen so that everyone's aware that there's a team that can look at it disaggregated, so they can think of just universal skills that a lot of students may be struggling with, or just identify different patterns that the data may be showing in terms of student-teacher relationships or functional behavior, or kinds of days, for instance, similar like how we think of looking through office discipline referrals, and which stakeholder need additional information so that they can support the student very well. I think I saw, we've mainly, I'm seeing some comments on the chat about videos available for the skills coaching. So I've embedded a video in this presentation, which will be made available to you on the topic page of the School Climate Transformation Grant. And if you email me directly, I can definitely share with you the handout, which will Adobe allows you to play a video, but it's 17 minutes long, and it goes into each step of the ISLA process. So it walks through the the checking, the debrief, the behavioral skills coaching, the practice of the reconnection conversation, and that reentry process. So we get to provide opportunities to role play, but through the videos, we also allow folks to really see these ideas in more concretely, and can see the balance and the science and the art together in these conversations with students. So you do have this available, and will have available to you. So I'm just going to skip it for the purpose of time. At this moment, I want to make sure there's some questions here. So ISLA, one of the questions that I'm looking at, if there's evidence of these practices with pre-K to 2, ISLA has been implemented so far or tried with middle schools. I know there's been efforts at the elementary level that our principal investigator has been able to adapt with elementary schools in California. In terms of published evidence, that might be in progress, but we've definitely started to work with elementary schools to adapt this process to younger age. I will be providing the ISLA website in a moment so that you get to write it down. And in case you have more questions of how to adapt this at the elementary level, or would like to ask for resources adapted developmentally for these groups of students, you can do so by reaching out to the group then. So in terms of another question that I see here is, how do you record this process as a support strategy and not a removal or in-school suspension after a certain amount of time? So with the schools that have been implementing ISLA, right, they do have Office of Discipline referrals through like Swiss, but we record this process through Google Forms that develop into spreadsheets, right? And we can share those with schools if you reach out to us, because the process has been very easily adapted. And it's really recording time in, time out, the purpose of the visit. And by the time in and time out, you do get to automatically calculates the amount of time. Of course, if it becomes an 8-hour or 6.5-hour visit, it gets interpreted as an in-school suspension. And sometimes schools do write that directly on there, because as some systems may have already procedures that says that with this type of incident, automatic in-school suspension instead. But through this spreadsheet, you do get to record it as a restorative conversation that happened, and then through the time or some of the notes sections that you have within the spreadsheet that we've developed, you can differentiate between what ended up being more of an ISLA restorative conversation, as I've talked to you about it today, or what kind of like was an automatic in-school suspension based on school policies already developed or in place. How do we bring this approach to our state? It's another question that I'm seeing here. Definitely let me show you this contact page, as I see that we are very close to our end time. You have my contact information here if you want a handout or any of the resources, but I do encourage you to go directly onto the ISLA website, which you can see on here, deniselab.org/ISLA/, where you can go through our preview videos of each module of the prevention components of the intervention, the effective responses to behavior, the outside ISLA out of classroom process and the reconnection conversations. There's a video of each of those available to you, and there's also the contact information so that you can get in touch with the team, and more communication in terms of training and how to bring this to your state can happen. Let me see. I'm seeing here for folks that in one of the schools, the question seems like there's been an increase of fights and, TikTok challenges encouraging destructive behaviors, bomb threats. Can this approach work? We've tried this approach during COVID, before COVID, during COVID, and now after COVID. And our schools definitely experience similar trends in the increase of physical altercation, but also these TikTok challenges. And we did use the ISLA framework to encourage more support and behavior skills coaching with the student. And it did have an effect on students engaging academic behavior, and disruptive behavior decreases as well. And our team is working on reporting and writing all these findings so that we can disseminate them with the community soon. So yes, you can use this approach, and it does have a positive impact if implemented with fidelity. So lastly, as my last question on here about MTSS and the use of ISLA. So MTSS or PBIS is really like the infrastructure where we have a team that's leading an effort, an implementation effort, right? We have this team that is getting trained on for instance, the restorative practices or all the components of the ISLA framework. You have this team really get training on each of these components and build their capacity so that they can bring into their schools professional development opportunities for its staff. And that might look different depending on how your professional learning communities have been set up. There might be weekly staff meetings where our teams have used those opportunities to bring in specific components of ISLA that, based on an implementation checklist, like how we have the tier fidelity inventory for PBIS, ISLA also has an implementation checklist with it that a team will complete to really analyze where they're at with implementation efforts and what may make more sense for the team to tackle first. Not everything at once, because it's a multi-component, and trying to do everything at once is not really going to help you be too successful about it. But, you have a team leading those efforts. You're collecting specific data through like this spreadsheet, through ODRs, to suspension and in-school suspensions that team will analyze. And similar to how it's done with MTSS and PBIS, you use your data sources and you're encouraged to look at them segregated so that you can really identify who the intervention is working for and to whom we need to really be adapting this intervention because we're not being too successful. And in terms of procedures and policies in schools, there is really a lot of intentional conversation that's happening at the team level, but with the staff as well, in terms of calibrating how folks are responding to behaviors. So there's different activities that are getting done to to understand how things are getting interpreted, to inform changes and reform to the policies so that they become more preventative rather than punitive. So just different ways in which you can really be adapting the ISLA within MTSS is really has the same elements, mainly the practices that you're implementing, maybe at the classroom level or as part of your outside of the ISLA process would be maybe what is new to your school system that you would be building capacity for and implementing based on an action plan. So I see it's 9 a.m. and I want to be respectful of your time. I see that, yes, you can access the video, not the materials yet. If you do want access to materials, please communicate through the contact us information on the website, because we are kind of monitoring more closely at this point who's getting access and how are things gonna get tried in places. But please do communicate through the contact us subpage or topic page there on the website. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.